So can you all see it? Okay. I'm going to start this presentation, the ILO development and globalization, big issues. So I cannot hope to address them to the fullest extent. I'm totally sure about that. So I'm giving you some of my reflections on these topics. So the task was after 1945. I understand that you are already well familiar with the ILO and its history, its beginnings, its structure, and so on. So I won't say too much about it, and I will also refrain, although that would be a topic that could be of interest to all of us today. I will also refrain from talking about women's ILO because I know that you will have the pleasure to have the expert around with you next week, Eloisa Betti, when she will talk about women's ILO. So I will restrict myself a little bit. The program. I want first to start with a couple of reflections on the question, whose organization is the ILO? What kind of workers, what kind of work does it represent? So certainly I can give you part of the answer right away. It's not all kind of workers and it's not all kind of work that it represents, even not today. There has been a dynamic of globalization of the ILO, certainly, but there are still areas where we can reflect on what is it if the ILO talks about, or others like myself talk about global social policy actually. So the second step would be to talk about the ILO as a development agency. And the third step is to talk about the ILO and globalization. And as I said, big issues. I can hope to cover it all. So I will focus on the ILO as development agency, and then see how these discussions taking place under this heading translate into the ILO and globalization issue later on. So first, whose organization? As I said, it's a multi-layered question. So the ILO at its beginnings, but also today, one could argue, represents only a tiny fraction of the world's working population. So that kind of question, whose organization, could be posed in two different ways. It's first about representation. Who decides in the ILO? Who is represented to be there in the tripartite structure of the ILO? And certainly also the question of what kind of work, what concept of work is represented in the ILO. So Eloisa next week will have a lot to say about the position of women and women's work, which is also one of these areas where we could discuss a lot about this separation between in and out, included, excluded. And so now, I wanted to start with this picture. As you probably know, this is the new Director General the ILO has just elected, or the governing body of the ILO has just elected, Gilbert Humbo from Togo, former Prime Minister of Togo. And I start with this picture because it already represents some of the central questions that I will talk about today. So he's, as you might know, the first African in the position, the first African Director General. And so in my own work, that rings a couple of bells. So it rings the bell that representation of Africans in the ILO was for a long time a very contested issue. So even in the 1950s, there was a discussion whether the ILO should be allowed to open a regional office in Africa, like it had done before in other parts of the world. So the colonial powers were actually up against that. Britain, France, Portugal, all were against opening such an office, which would have just coordinated in the region or on the continent. So it was not a given that Africa would be represented in the ILO. In the 1960s, there were the first discussions on whether the post of the Director General should go to an African. So with the independence of so many African nations, that was an issue that was brought to the table first in the 1960s. So now we are in the 2020s. The other point that we could look into is what does this mean for the kind of work that the ILO represents? So as much as I know, and I didn't know much about the person myself, obviously, he's the present director of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is also makes it quite probable that he will put an emphasis on this area of work in which a considerable portion of the world's working population works. This is also not a given. So agricultural work has been something that has been for a long time on the sidelines in the ILO. Not a blind spot, but on the sidelines. So these are the two things that come to my mind immediately when I hear these news. So I want to start before 1945. I hope you will allow me to do so, Lorenzo, and it's just to make sure that the break that takes place in 1945 becomes more tangible. So the ILO was founded as a European organization. That's safe to say. European organization with regard to the kind of worker that it focused on, and that is by and large the European male, blue-collar, so to say, industrial worker, who was the norm of standard setting. And that, of course, again, and it cannot be emphasized enough, even at that time, on the height of industrialization, represented only a really, really small proportion of the world's working population, even if you put that question in a more conservative way. So the ILO had there's no doubt about it, had a European bias in the beginning. And so this bias could be seen in many aspects. I want to focus first on one example, and that is the example of so-called native or colonial labor, which could be taken to exemplify this bias in the first part of the century. So when the ILO was founded, a colonial clause became part of the ILO's constitution, meaning that the colonial powers were free to apply labor standards that they had adopted for the motherland, so to speak, to their colonies. And if they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And for most part of the interwar years, the whole complex of native labor was treated as a separate form of labor. So the rules that apply to the working populations in other countries didn't apply to colonial workers. And there was one convention in 1930 which confirmed this point, because it was part of a separate native labor code, which all of that circled around the problem of forced labor, systematic forced labor. The forced labor convention, on the one hand side, or conventions, on the one hand side, they brought a lot of progress in terms of a humanitarian approach. So they condemned the worst forms of abuse of colonial labor. So the systematic use of forced labor for infrastructure projects, for example, widespread in colonial territories at the time. At the same time, as much as they condemned these worst forms, they also sanctioned the use of other forms, which were regarded as partly allowed. And all of these were forms of forced labor that would not have been acceptable at the time in metropolitan countries. One example, the convention spoke about certain civil obligations that would be excluded from this convention, or from its application. What it wanted to say is forms of forced labor that were used for smaller infrastructure projects on a communal level that the colonial officials could just ask the inhabitants of a region to perform. But of course, civil obligations brings the idea, or comes with the idea, that we're talking about citizens. But they were no citizens. They were subjects to colonial rule at the time. So civil obligations, normal civil obligations, but without the rights of citizenship, of course. So this separate realm of native labor is one aspect of the larger aspect of the ILO's bias at the time. And even when this regime, so to speak, ended after the Second World War in a couple of conventions on social policy independent territories, that was the nomenclature for colonies at that time, it was still a separate part of the ILO's convention. It was no more called native labor, but it was called social policy independent territories, as distinguished from social policy in other territories. So this is one example we can start from. There are other early blind spots in the ILO's activities. Agricultural labor wasn't a very prominent part for quite a long time. Intellectual labor was included in the 1920s, but the whole area of what we today, in a more modern term, call informal labor, was completely out of the picture. Same with indigenous labor in independent countries. That all came later. They were excluded in the early days, except for intellectual, which became a part. So, from a bird's eye view, one could see the history. Nevertheless, the history of the ILO is a history of continuous expansion. Expansion in a geographical sense. The ILO did become more global. It regionalized, and conceptually with regard to the categories of work and workers it represented. In a geographical sense, already in the 1930s, the ILO extended to Latin America, or to the Western Hemisphere in general. After the Second World War, it further extended to become, by and large, a global organization from the 1960s, 1970s onwards. The story of its expansion into fields of work is much more complicated. So the ILO, as I already mentioned, also started quite early on to develop an interest in other forms of labor other than industrial labor. And this process is far from concluded, but it is step by step. It has become more global in these fields as well. And I'm once again next week, when you will hear from Eloisa, you will get an idea of what were the differences in this particular aspect. So conceptually, the question of development, and I'm almost arrived at my second point. The question of social and economic development in less industrialized areas of the world, picking up the language of the sources from now on, which first speak about developing countries, then in more recent times more often about the global South. This interest was there even in the 1920s and 30s. But in a minute, I will talk about the turn of the tide that really took place in 1944 and 1945 in this regard. So I want to start this part on the ILO and development with the Declaration of Philadelphia. Just because this is the point in time when the ILO receives or issues itself a development mandate. So the Declaration of Philadelphia, which you will have heard about in the preceding sessions, did two things. The entire work of the ILO was redefined as being work for human rights. So it received a new human rights foundation to all of its work. And the second important change in the Declaration of Philadelphia, it defined a social objective for all policies. So in the language of the Philadelphia Declaration, the first point, all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. So the ILO wanted to cater to all people, all working people and all people on a human rights foundation. And the other part all national and international policies and measures, in particular those of an economic and financial character, should be judged in this light and accepted only insofar as they might be held to promote and not to hinder the achievement of this fundamental goal. And lastly, always from the Declaration of Philadelphia, an explicit development mandate for the ILO. So it talked about to promote the economic and social advancement of the less developed regions of the world. So for the good of the entire world, in terms of these countries being a resource for the world, for primary material, for example, but also, again, on the Human Rights Foundation, for the sake of the people themselves. And it went further and included the colonies, which were at that point in time the areas where the development idea caught on most prominently, actually. So it said that the principles set forth in this declaration are fully applicable to all peoples everywhere, and that while the manner of the application must be determined with due regard to the stage of social and economic development reached by each people, their progressive application to peoples who are still dependent, as well as those who have already achieved self-government, is a matter of concern to the whole civilized world. So that is the mandate. And from that point in time onwards, and in the next years, the years that followed after 1945, this became a practice. So, but I read to you, I presented to you the mandate, the Declaration of Philadelphia. But now I would like to point you that it took more than that, more than words, to make the ILO into a development agency. So first of all, we have to see the historical background of the beginning of development activities in the ILO. There's first of all, there's decolonization. Of course, I just give you a number. In 1945, the ILO had around 45 members. And in 1970, this number grew to around 120 something. And the bulk of these new members were ex-colonies. And by definition, at the time, they were developing countries. So there was, within a short period of time, a complete turnover in the ILO, to the extent that the majority of its members defined themselves and were defined by others as developing countries. And since these countries had an interest in the ILO, or as much as they had an interest in the ILO, it was certainly not in the kind of activities that the ILO had engaged in the preceding years, which was mostly standard setting activities. So they were interested in something else, because they saw, and righteously saw, that the majority of standards had not been defined with their situation in mind. So they wanted the ILO to give more practical help. That was one side of the trajectory that led to the ILO becoming a development agency. The other one was the Cold War. So one has to say or to point out that the Soviet Union in these years immediately after the war was not a member of the ILO. So one could, and I would say that from many points of view, the ILO was a frontline organization in the Cold War in these first years. There were some members from Eastern Bloc countries, Poland, for example, Czechoslovakia, were members even after 1945, but the Soviet Union stayed out till the mid-1950s. And which also meant, and it's a longer history, that the American influence in the ILO was significant. One event that brings this perfectly to the fore is that in 1948, David Morse became the Director General of the ILO. David Morse, an American, had been part of the in his younger years in the early 1930s. He had been part of Roosevelt's New Deal administration in the Ministry of the Interior and then in the National Labor Administration. He became later on part of the occupational administration, first in Italy and then in Germany. In both capacities, his task was to revitalize democratic trade unionism. And then he became, under the Truman administration, a couple of years later, he became the first deputy minister of labor, or secretary of labor for international affairs within the Ministry of the American Ministry of Labor. And one of his tasks was to gather on the merits of his former activities in the US Army, to gather the support for the Marshall Plan from the trade union side in France and in other European countries. And it's also safe to say that he became Director General of the ILO because the Truman administration hoped to bring this strategy to the UN system, to the International Labour Organization, to be precise. Also, at the same time, Truman's Point 4 program in his second inauguration speech in 1949, when Morse was already the Director General, committed the US to rendering development aid to developing countries as a means to win the hearts and minds of people in a Cold War setting. And that was the beginnings of Morse's own considerations about the ILO becoming a development agency. So in the ILO, you can see that when his first task was in European reconstruction, it very soon the emphasis shifted to developing countries for a couple of reasons I can go into here. But that is an important background to the ILO becoming a development agency. So from the early 1950s onwards, technical assistance grows into the second pillar of the ILO's activities, next to standard setting. At the heart of this early technical assistance activities, which have a longer history, I mentioned that before, they started already in the 1920s and 30s, when the ILO sent out first technical assistance missions to Latin American countries, to Southeastern European countries, for example. This was in a way different, because it was mainly focused on manpower, on vocational training, for a reason. I will go into that in a second. For the ILO, and I will also mention this only shortly now because I will talk about it in a minute as well, it regarded it as part of a package. So it was not technical assistance instead of standard setting. It was technical assistance and standard setting, which was labeled as being the other side of the same coin. So technical assistance in the 1950s rested on strong ideas of modernization, which were very common in this early generation of developmental thinkers who were behind these programs in the 1950s. So the simple story, or the simple concept of how development worked, was there was a traditional sector and there was a modern sector, and the modern sector was the industrial sector, the traditional was the agricultural sector. And by and large, it was a process in which the labor force would go from one end, from the agricultural, from the traditional one, to the other one. And it would absorb it, and then you would have the same kind of industrialized societies that already existed in the West or in industrialized countries. It's a very strong modernization paradigm. It cannot be emphasized enough how strong it actually was. So what the ILO did was to cater for exactly that kind of process with its vocational training programs, with an emphasis on manpower. And even though it came from actually from a European background, it fitted exactly in this kind of mindset. So the ILO would help this process by providing those people in transition with training to become industrial men. So the next step came at the end of the 1960s, when the ILO launched the World Employment Program. And this World Employment Program was, first of all, and one has maybe to say some to give one more information. The kind of technical assistance that the ILO gave in the 1950s and larger parts of the 1960s was really small scale. It was small scale in comparison to what other international organizations had or gave or administered, but it was also small in absolute numbers. And that changed as well at the end of the 1960s. The reason, or the initial point of departure, was that this dual model of development theory was in deep crisis in the 1960s. That became obvious that it didn't work that way. That especially that even countries who had higher growth rates in the developing countries were not doing better. On the opposite, there was widespread poverty, and that became an issue. And there was all this talk about the so-called population bomb, especially in Western countries, which would ultimately lead to eat away all of what development accomplished for this country. So it was a perception that this model was in crisis. So the ILO's answer, and the ILO was not the only organization that reacted on this, was to launch a huge program like other organizations launched bigger programs too at the same time, to create so-called productive employment, to make employment the central emphasis of all development efforts. And by that, it delivered a contribution to the second UN development decade, the 1970s. So the World Employment Program, everybody who has heard me talk about the ILO before knows that I find that a really interesting topic. Came up with a new approach to development. Again, it was not the only institution that came up with this kind of concept, but it was as a transmitter of this concept, it was quite prominent at the time. So the basic paradigmatic shift is maybe a bit too much because it was still about growth, but it replaced the sole emphasis on growth with and growing awareness for the problem of poverty and the concept of poverty alleviation as a precondition for development to take place and to be sustainable. Through its nature, the way how it was done through pilot projects, country projects, it established, helped to establish a couple of someone has the microphone open. Okay. So, no. One of these concepts was the informal sector. So it gave a lot of attention to these people working in what we today would call non-standard employment, self-employed people who certainly are not in the reach of ILO labor standards. Another one was redistribution from growth, meaning that the fruits of development should be distributed in a more just, socially just way. So starting from a Keynesian assumption of strengthening consumers and broadening the consumer base also, it proposed measures like land reform, like progressive taxation, which is by the way, one of the reasons why the World Employment Program wasn't always very popular with local elites, not necessarily. So it was regarded as a very Western also concept. A focus on rural development. I've given you a couple of photos here. So one of the leaders of the program was Hans Singer, one of the former UN official. Another one was on the right, on the upper right, Dudley Sears, the head of the Sussex-based Institute for Development Studies, and on the bottom edge, Amartya Sen, who also became a part of it, a marginal part of it, but it was involved in the research being done in the framework of the World Employment Program. So it left a research legacy in many areas. So, so why I find this so interesting is not only because of the paradigmatic shift, because that wasn't, as I said, that much important, I would say, in the long run, and especially if you measure the impact of the World Employment Program, as as far as it is possible at all, it was probably quite insignificant. But it was an interesting example of how what's the importance of the development issue also for international organizations, because apart from its country reports establishing a couple of terms and the research legacy, it was important for the ILO because it became more visible as a development agency, and it acquired new sources of outside funding, because that's what the World Employment Program was also about, that it was funded by certain governments. Scandinavian countries, for example, invested in the World Employment Program. So that was quite important for the ILO, and that is also something that covered in hindsight some of the downsides of the World Employment Program for the ILO itself, because it's also an example for how these programs are planned and how they actually work. Because, for example, it was planned as being across all departments of the ILO. This should be a program that was owned by the ILO. It should also be a program in which the ILO took the leadership within a larger group of international organizations. All of that didn't happen. It was very centralized, was very isolated within the ILO. But that, in the long run, didn't matter as long as it brought certain profits to the ILO in terms of visibility and also sources. So that's why I'm mentioning it in that extended way. So before I switch to globalization, there's a missing link, and I want to change the perspective once more in talking about development, and it's the issue of development and human rights in the ILO and the relationship of the two areas. So the 1950s already, as you can see from this chart, was the actual human rights decade in the ILO. So the ILO, what it considers today its human rights standards, they were all adopted in the period between 1948, freedom of association, trade union freedoms, mostly equal remuneration, gender equality is the issue here. 1951, forced labor, once again, I will talk about that in a second. 1957, and discrimination, employment and occupation in 1958, plus human rights references in several more technical conventions at the time. So why? So against the background of decolonization, human rights were seen as a way to counter the negative effects of decolonization on standard setting. So as I said, most of the new countries were not so much interested in standard setting. So ILO officials foresaw, ILO constituents foresaw that it would come with downgrading of the whole standard setting area. So to define human rights standards was one way to keep a minimum of standards there, which again were thought to be in against the background of the modernization paradigm I just talked about, which would then help to create the floor on which development could become sustainable. And that is the core of the ILO's integrated approach to development, human rights as a tool of sustainable development. That's, however, not the way that it worked out. So, and I want to choose two examples to illustrate my point here. That is, firstly, the point of freedom of association, trade union freedoms, and the other one is forced labor. So, freedom of association. The conventions on freedom of associations and the right to collective bargaining, they were seen as a huge success, by and large, as a huge success for the trade union movement internationally. In the Cold War context, and from the mid-1950s, as I said, the Soviet Union was part of the ILO, re-entered the ILO. So the Cold War entered full-fledged into the ILO. And there was a lot of convergence, there was a lot of cooperation underneath, but there was also a lot of partly fierce debates, and some of them, the fiercest debates, took place on the occasion of the adoption of standards, because as in the case of freedom of association, there were different concepts to play. So to put it in a more placative way, there was the Western concept of free trade unions against the Eastern concept of trade unions, as Lenin had put it, the conveyor belt of the party in industry, in the economy. And so there was a competition between these concepts. Maybe sometimes hidden, but there was a competition. And for many of the leaders of the newly independent countries, it was a question, which of these concepts is better suited to help the development effort? And mostly they came around to the conclusion that if it was not the Soviet model, then it was still far less the Western concept of free trade unions that would apply. Because, and that is something that comes to the fore in the debates on freedom of association and other issues in the 1950s, late 1950s mostly, and then in the 1960s. Underdevelopment was regarded or was termed as a state of emergency that equaled a state of war. And in a war, there has to be national unity. All forces have to work together for the common goal. So that was the kind of rhetoric that was used by, for example, that's why I put this photograph of one of the African leaders at the time, the Ahmed Sékou Touré from Guinea, who himself had been a trade unionist before the Guinean independence was achieved, and the then Prime Minister of Guinea very strongly argued for this state of emergency argument. Another reason might be that free trade unions changed their character, their meaning, from the perspective of African nationalist leaders and others in other parts of the world as well, from being a tool to challenge colonialism as one of the only groups that were allowed to act in public. So they had a really political role, but they lost this political role. This political role turned into something that was perceived as dangerous, potentially dangerous. Plus, most of these trade unions were in strategically important areas. So railway workers, for example, or sometimes teachers. So there was hesitation, to put it mildly, to accept the kind of freedom of association that the ILO's convention actually promised. Very similar discussion took place with regard to forced labor. So forced labor, first of all, was regarded from the 1930s, I talked about that before, were regarded the classical colonial crime. So colonialism was about forced labor. So, and even in the 1950s, with a view to the apartheid regime in South Africa, it was clear that this was about forced labor, getting people, separating people, and then bringing them to work from these separate areas. So this kind of apartheid complex before the word existed, that was what forced labor was from many people's view in these countries, the grid of what forced labor was about. But in the 1950s, the discussion was on a different aspect of forced labor. So this 1957 convention on the abolition of forced labor for political and economic purposes was actually in the beginning an initiative from the American trade unions side, which wanted to target systems of forced labor in the Soviet rule, the Gulag. So that was the background after the Second World War, and most of the time when this discussion took place. The initiative in the beginning wasn't that clear. So it was also about the memories of the Nazi camps, of course. But in the 1950s, it was really a discussion that was had a clear Cold War focus. So what came out of it was a convention that wanted to abolish forced labor for political and economic purposes. And once again, it had unintended consequences. One example is in the 1960s, early 1960s, some African countries, West African countries mostly, introduced so-called youth labor services, which regularly were part of the army, an alternative service. So people were recruited to work in infrastructure projects, for example, as an alternative or as a part of the normal recruitment. But these labor services contradicted the spirit of the 1957 convention, which some of these countries had ratified. And what made this discussion so violent at times was that those who accused these African countries, in the early time, it was the issue was brought up by ILO commissions, but then it was countries like Portugal, who still was a colonial power at the time, who tried to attack countries like Ghana on human rights issues. So to turn the table on African countries who used the ILO regularly as a forum for anti-colonial agitation. So once again, this became something very principled. So many of these African countries then took issue with how this was interpreted, because they saw these labor services obviously not as forced labor, but they saw it as a means to build the nation. And so apart from the end of the issue was resolved at some point, this was once again an issue about human rights versus development. Are human rights compatible with the development effort? And the discussions on this issue went right into the ILO itself. So there were parts of the ILO staff, ILO officials, who thought that human rights standards should not be applied to developing countries immediately, because they hindered the development effort. So they argued for a more gradual way of achieving that goal. So my last point, it's shorter than the other two, the ILO and globalization. So before I talk about the ILO and globalization, I just want to give you a little bit of background on the 1990s, when most of these discussions on globalization, the role of the ILO within globalization actually started. So one could say that at the beginning of the 1990s, the ILO, and at the end of the Cold War, the ILO had lost momentum. Could you argue it had lost it already earlier than that, but it was regarded by many as a low point with regard to the ILO's influence. So many reasons for that. One obviously is that neoliberal turn in economics, end of Keynesian primate of Keynesian economics, which the ILO was always quite wedded to. So at this point in time, it was very difficult for the ILO to have its voice heard in any kind of discussion, but especially when it came to development. And to come out of this dilemma, the two terms most prominent from the 1990s onwards relate directly to that circumstances. That's first the definition of core labor standards at the beginning of the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s, and the decent work agenda, which a little bit later in 2000 really started, and to this very day is one of the major buzzwords under which the ILO operates. Both have to do with this period of crisis. And when I talk now very shortly about the ILO and globalization, I choose three focus areas. It's first the social clause debate, mostly from the 1980s onwards, the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, which defines core labor standards, and the decent work agenda and its implications for the whole aspect of precarious work, which we deal with today. So first of all, the social clause debate. The idea behind social clause, I think you're aware of that kind of discussion, is to include social standards into trade agreements. It's a practice that is quite common on a bilateral scheme, but there was always the idea that ILO standards could form part of international trade agreements. And this, from the 1970s, especially 80s, 90s, turned into a really, really fierce debate along the North-South axis with the ILO caught in between. The proponents, the major proponents of the social clause idea, Western trade unionists, but also governments, in particular the American government, both in the Reagan years as well as in the Clinton years. And on the other side, who rationalized this along human rights discourses, a liberal human rights discourse. And on the other side, the bulk of developing countries of the Global South, which saw social clauses as a thinly veiled attempt to protectionism, to derive the developing countries of their competitive advantages and to close markets and so on. So for the ILO, the implications were that when the World Trade Organization was founded in 1995, the ILO had no access to this discussion. And that was because the developing countries, especially countries like Malaysia, were absolutely against any kind of participation of the ILO in the context of the liberalization of world trade. It didn't want to hear anything about social clauses in this context. So the ILO was in the preparation for the founding meeting. The ILO was even excluded, disinvited from taking part in that. So the answer the ILO found to this situation, and it's the threat of its further marginalization, one part of the answer was the definition of core labor standards. So in the Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, 1998, the ILO defines a couple of these standards which should in future serve as core labor standards. Core labor standards meaning they are applicable to all member states regardless of ratification. So it's a minimum of standards that everybody should agree on. That's freedom of association, that's forced labor, it's discrimination, employment and occupation, and that's child labor, the abolition of child labor. The core labor standards discussion, I have no time to go into that any further now. But it's a continuation of the discussions of that started in the 1960s, and the ILO had to make, of course, many compromises. But the result was this: a set of core labor standards. There was a lot of criticism against core labor standards in the beginning, because the argument of the opponents was, so if you define core labor standards, what happens to all the other standards? They lose in significance. That's obvious. So if everybody focuses just on the core labor standards, then all these other standards lose. And that is a problem also from a human rights perspective, because the ILO maybe, one could say that represents a very particular take on human rights. So it's about all kinds of human rights, and it is the only organization that integrates these rights, political rights, like freedom of association, like freedom from forced labor, with social rights. And these social rights are mostly hidden in these more technical standards, occupational health, for example, or standards on social security, or all these other standards that are not part of core labor standards. So there's a problem about this separation. The decent work agenda started in 2000 as with the new Director General, the first one from the Global South, if you so will, the Chilean diplomat Juan Somavia, is again partly a response to this criticism directed against the concept of core labor standards, because it confirms the commitment to all working people everywhere. And it also contains a commitment to labor standards beyond core labor standards. So this is a definition. So it has a lot of content by the ILO. There's something material in it. There's something immaterial in it. So it's pretty broad concept what constitutes decent work on a global scale, and that, of course, obviously is part of the criticism that this concept received, that it's quite wishy-washy, and there's a translation problem to several languages from the English decent work, or the term decent. But that is only understandable if we go back to this to the situation in the 1990s, definition of core labor standards as a response already to this crisis, and then the decent work agenda to get back in all these other groups of work and workers. So today, and that is what I want to conclude with for today, the question is again, whose organization is the ILO today? So there are contradictory trends. Core labor standards, decent work are, once again, from a certain point of view, they are success stories, but they are at the same time, they are intensifying debates on the ILO's relevance in today's world of work. And I want to go back for 1 second to the question of the double question of representation. And there is a positive example how it could play out in some respects for the ILO, and there is a more negative example. And the positive example is the question of domestic work, which is one of the signature forms of work in the present age. Not only because these are so many people working in this kind of in care work. It's a really globalized phenomenon, but also because it's mostly female labor. So maybe Eloisa once again will also talk about that next time. So I want to focus on the question of representation. So it wasn't easy to get this into the realm of ILO standard setting. Not easy at all. The ILO succeeded it's one of the last standards in a time period where hardly any new international labor standards are adopted. But this was one of them in 2011 on domestic work. And it was possible because one of the main questions about representation is the position of NGOs, of non-unionized workers within the realm of the ILO's tripartite structure. Because it's the group of domestic workers is one that really lacks unionization for obvious reasons. And so mostly, if there is organization, it is by NGOs. And for the international trade union movement, it was a question of principle whether they should integrate these NGOs, which in some ways are competitors, if you see it like that, for representation. In this case, they did. And that is part of the explanation why it was successful. The other example, and I can again not hope to go into it in any way sufficient to the extent of the problem, is precarious work. And especially if we go to look to platform work, which is a growing sector. It's not yet that significant, but of course we can all see it by now, and especially in the Corona period, we see an explosion of food delivery services. We saw in the years before the rise of services like Uber, who compete with taxis. And there's a huge problem when it comes to get that into the realm of the ILO. It's not only, again, it's about unionization, but it's also another side. These employers, which they are, Uber or food delivery services like Foodora, are employers, but they do not accept that description for themselves. So they pose as apps, as providers of a platform. And there's a conceptual problem, because of course they are also not part of the International Organization of Employers in the ILO, which represents or organizes employer organizations in the ILO. So they are outside of, so very recently the ILO has published a flagship report on platform work, and there the problem becomes very obvious that it's a very lucid account and analysis of what the problem in this sector is, and it's growing and growing and growing, and it affects not only these flagship areas, it also applies to many forms of labor that used to be standard employment in the older terms. So there is really a dynamic that sucks out workforce from regular employment into these new forms of non-regulated employment. But what is also obvious on the report of the ILO, there's no mentioning, or at least no prominent mentioning, of standard setting, because, and I think my interpretation is because there is no perspective of standard setting in this area anytime soon. There is on a national level, but in the ILO, very, very hard to get that kind of work in. So the question of representation, once again. So I hope I didn't exceed your patience. I talked more than an hour. I'm sorry for that. That wasn't my intention. I got carried away, as you can see. So thank you very much for the attention. I'm looking forward for any kind of question and comments that you might want to make.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you so much for this incredibly rich speech. You have reminded to me, I mostly knew all this, but you have put it all together, an incredible amount of ideas, of implications of this, dealing with the life of this body, which deals with the labor issues on an from an international point of view. I know you don't have much time. I don't know how much do you have, but I know you have to leave in I think in
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay. So I have some questions, but before this, I would like to know if the students have something to ask. I don't know if you have some ideas, or even simply questions to need for some kinds of clarification. As you have understood, of course, this is one, we have largely mentioned it during our course, of course, but this is one of the major specialized agencies of the United Nations, and it deals with something that is at the center of our life, of course, of our life and of the life of every people, basically everywhere. So it's something very, very, very important, and something that certainly deserves an attention from the international point of view. Something that should really be better regulated than it is, and the ILO makes some efforts in this direction, even though not always with success. Do you have any questions? Do you have something, some remarks or something like this? Please don't be shy. You can do it.
I just talked too long. I just
no, don't worry, don't worry. But it's
I destroyed you.
This is a shyness that is typical, okay?
Yeah.
Very typical. So I ask you a few things, Daniel. I must say that if I have 3 or 4 general things. The first, you have basically answered to the first one. I was thinking to that, but you have exactly finished on that. So I only want to stress this aspect, the problem of representation, which is something that has, for what I remember, and for you to wrote, you wrote also in your book. You didn't show your book, you should do it.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
At least the cover of your book, of your.
Yes, and I have to say that there's an Italian translation.
Yes, there is also the Italian translation. Okay, here we have part of the students are
Lorenzo
Italian.
can just pass that information maybe on to you a little bit later.
But you can show it if you have it right here while I'm talking. You can.
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay.
No, just
in
give me a second. I have it as a slide, so I will go back for a second.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, here. So.
Yes. Okay. The original version, English version. Okay. You have your first book about the ILO and the colonization. Okay. And then the ILO history published in 2019. There is also an Italian version, as Daniel was saying, that is, and they are not the first book that you can see here, the red one, not that one, but the other one, the history of the International Organization, is freely downloadable on the website of the ILO itself. So
yes,
you can download it. Okay,
Italian.
You're not stealing everything if you do it, even though Daniel needs to be paid for his intellectual work as a basic labor standard. Okay, Daniel. Aside from this, representation, very, very quickly. Well, I think you have basically said everything about that. 2 things. The first, if I'm not wrong, just tell me if I'm wrong. It was this problem of a real representation of the forces that participate in the ILO bodies, like the International Labour Conference. Trade unions, first of all, was raised for concerning Italy, if I'm not wrong, 1922-23, for the fascist trade unions, which were seen as not real trade unions. This was, if I'm not wrong, the first political concern about representation of some of the forces. And then it was raised again in many occasions during the Cold War about the Soviet employers, which were not totally free employers, of course, etc., etc.
Yes.
Which is Daniel, the answer to this kind of, I mean, this is a problem that has been raised a lot of times for different reasons, which is the answer, the mainstream answer to this kind of problems that has been established, affirmed in the ILO life. I remember something, there were commissions to study this problem.
Yes.
And can we still apply also to the problems that you have raised at the end? Or can we still use the fact that, well, please just tell us what you think, and then.
Yeah, I think, I mean the 1950s and the discussion on the role of Soviet representation, both with regard to trade union and trade unions and employers. I think it's very important to start from that, because I think that we're still in that. It's still a consequence of that decisions being taken at the time, because in the end of the 1950s, it was the trade unions that first softened their approach on questioning on principle the credentials of Soviet representatives or of Eastern European, and as a consequence, of course, the same rules or same pragmatic approach applied to representatives from developing countries, which were obviously sent by the government or were not from the most representative organization, but one popular with the governments. The employers differently. They were much more rigorous on their resistance against this. So they constantly voted out the Soviet employers from any kind of committees or and so on, but they didn't apply the same rigorousness to those from developing countries, because it followed a Cold War logic. So while the employers group was much more in the hands of the Americans or dominated by the Americans, who were always more restrictive in that regard, the trade union side it's a constant struggle between those hawks in the American trade unions and the softer European Western trade union organizations. So it's very hard to relate that to today's situation, but there were occasions, of course, when these discussions came up from both sides of the Iron Curtain. There was the case of the Spanish trade unions in the 1960s, and in the later years of the Franco regime, there were the trade unions under the Argentinian and Chilean dictatorship. And there was the case of Poland, of Solidarność, and the stand that the ILO and especially the workers' group took on that. But other than that, it's very, very rarely happens that representatives of trade unions and also employers are challenged on principle reasons these days. So the representation is very much pragmatically solved, let's say.
Okay, great. My second question, very short, Daniel. The World Employment Program and this big program of the 1970s, which, as you said, based on the centrality of labor, of the men and women as workers, first of all, which was, I think, a very important and also very, from many points of view, revolutionary idea. Then it was part of that trend of the 1970s, in which Keynesian theories, but also a large number of quite radical for the time approaches were widespread, in the United Nations in general, but maybe first of all in the ILO. What happened to the World Employment Program? How it finished? It ended. If it ended, I imagine it ended, of course. But what has remained? What did practically? I mean, because you mentioned the fact that it was important for a number of ideas, etc., etc. But what about the concrete results?
The ideas remained,
okay.
But I think it's a very interesting question, because I think the attention for the whole basic needs complex, so the focus on poverty, that remained, and so did some of the buzzwords like the informal sector, and which opened a whole new perspective on some phenomena, and so not to see it as an aberration or something that has to be made into regular employment, but to see it as what it is. I think we can see that to this very day, that this has done something. But then, even with the ideas, I mean, the World Employment Program went until the 1990s, early 1990s, but this emancipatory approach, this what you say, rightly call a radical approach, that phased out already in the end of the 1970s. And that what is interesting about it is some of the concepts with regard to the informal labor were turned into something compatible with a more neoliberal approach, like this focus on the informal sector, and then as a next step, the talk about social entrepreneurship, about making people into entrepreneurs of their own as part of this attention to the informal sector. So that slowly but surely transformed the initial ideas, in something quite different from what the Sussex people thought it should be. And significantly enough, the term redistribution from growth, which was very prominent at the time. So the idea that this should be about social justice, it's not only about the best development concept. It's about making the target groups, being sure about the target groups of development. What should be development? Who should be developed? That disappeared. I mean, this whole redistribution thing completely disappeared for many reasons. As I said, not only because the Americans boycotted, but there wasn't so much of an interest in that kind of concept in some of the countries themselves. No, who got land. If we talk about land reform, for example, then it's crystal clear that this is not in everybody's interest. So that might be there are only complex answers to this. I'm sure if you talk to the protagonists of the World Employment Program, it was a success story in more than what I granted it in my talk aspects. So I really think, and I'm sorry that Sandrine is no more with us now, because she's always very critical of my talking about the WP, because she thinks it doesn't matter. It's just not important. But I think there is something to see if we study it.
Yes, we should study them probably more in depth, what they did in the 1970s, even in the 1980s to some extent.
Yes, and we would understand more about what the neoliberal turn also is about, and where it attacks, so to speak. So, which is a topic which interests me in particular. I'm more interested less in the failures of the World Employment Program, but more in why did it become so? Why was this turn so radical in the end of the 1970s? So it's not only the World Employment Program. We have all this talk about the new international economic order in the 1970s, which is also quite radical. And there are countries in the West, Scandinavian countries, which openly support these radical ideas of redistribution on a global scale. And then all of a sudden, in the 1980s, it dissipates in this plastic terms of sustainability, and you know, it's the same people. I mean, both of the big reports in the 1980s, the Brandt report and the Brundtland report, they're both written by social democrats, by people who have a reputation for being, even within social democracy, being more on the left side of things. And still, there's a quite a radical, and still, from the outside, seen from the outside, it's quite gradual, or people talk about the same things, but the meaning changes, and so it would be worth looking closer
we still have to study that. Yes. Okay, Daniel. My very last final question, only to finish this.
Yes.
What just this? It's not a real question. It is a real question, but it's a sort of prescriptive question. Given the fact that dealing with work at an international level is something necessary today more than ever. What should we do? How should we improve an organization like that, like the ILO, to make it more, to update it, or to upgrade it, if you want, to make it more adequate to our times?
This is, I mean, this is a question of that also I'm very, very interested in, and I'm really concerned about it. And I just want to second you on that. I think this is really important. And if I would have one message to convey in a talk like this as a historian, I think this is about now. This is really about now. And the only question I'm asking myself all the time, how did we get here? And also with the ILO, which is, I'm not even sure whether it's marginalized or whether it's on the brink of becoming something important once again. But I think what is important is that the ILO is a tool that should be there, that could be transformed in something very useful, even if we accept that the ILO is always has never been a radical organization. I said that on many occasions before. It's an organization to rein in the worst excesses of capitalism. So if we're into the end of capitalism or beyond capitalism game, which I'm partly are, then maybe the ILO is not the place to look at. But if we accept that we are in a period where it's really important to many people how this world of labor further develops, then I would say it's the best we have, no? And so one simple answer to the question, or one easy answer to the question, would be, I think there is this term of embedded liberalism, which the ILO could become a protagonist of, the meaning that if we really see a need at this time, it's for re-regulation, and it's not simple, it's not easy, but it's necessary. Like you say, things have to be regulated again, and the ILO has a long history of regulating the world of labor through standard setting, but also through other tools. And if we look to platform work, for example, so it's not easy. It's not easy to get that regulated, but it's necessary. It's just necessary because too many people become dependent on this. And those platform companies very often want to make us think that this is about flexibility, this is about consumers' choices and so on. And that might be true for some, but in the long run, it's about workers. It's about people having to work for their living. And if they end in a world where everything is reigned by platforms or by other forms of non-regulated labor, then this is a bad world. And we will pay the price on many already do that with right-wing populists on the march. So I think this is really an important matter. It's really important. It's not in the ivory tower. It's no ivory tower research being done on that. But yeah, no easy answers to that. But I think re-regulation is really, really necessary. And if the ILO could serve as a tool for that, then that would be very good.
And I think it could. Totally agree, Daniel. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this. At the end, we have taken more than 90 minutes. Sorry for, thank you for your time, first of all.
It was fun.
Because Daniel is now working in Amsterdam, working or doing research work in a wonderful place called the International Institute for Social History, located in Amsterdam. But he has given 2 hours of his time to give us this conference. So I am very grateful to him again, okay?
It's a pleasure, really.
Daniel, thank you so much again. Okay, we stay in touch for a lot of other reasons, of course. And thanks to the students who are here. See you tomorrow morning here in this room with the next 2 presentations, okay? Mm-hmm. Tomorrow we have
Professor.
UNHCR, and then I don't remember what else, but still, and UN Women. Okay. Yesterday we talked about the World Health Organization and something else. Okay, Daniel, thank you again.
Grazie
see you very soon.
Grazie a tutti.
Grazie mille. Ciao.
Ci vediamo.
Ci vediamo.